In this third and concluding part of Incoterms 2020, we will see certain common errors which can come in the usage, and therefore what kind of guidance is available from the ICC publications. We will also see a complete summary of all the terms as well as certain aspects which needs to be taken into account while looking at trading and related contracts of carriage. So just to summarize the 2020 Incoterms, the main divisions here, as the initial chart which we saw was with respect to Incoterms 2010. So any mode of transport, it remains the main ones remain the same. X works, you got one F term which is FCA, the C term which is CPT and CIP. What has changed between 2010 and 2020 is in the D terms. Here you have delivered at place, unloaded by the seller, and then delivered duty paid. The four terms with respect to sea and inland waterways remain the same between 2010 and 2020. But there are some more other changes which are there. No, it's not just that just only one term is revised between in 10 years time. There are a lot of changes which happens in the trade, in the banking system, in transportation, and that is the reason why there are revisions which happen almost like once in 10 years now. So what are some of the other changes which are there? We already seen the introduction of the new D term, removing DAT. We have got DPU which has come in, but you will find that there is a whole lot of guidance notes which has been enhanced in terms of making the right choice. Again, the general practice is to agree on an Incoterm and then try to fit the business around that. It has to happen the reverse in terms of telling that define the way the business is being done, define the way the transportation is being done, and then choose the right term. So the guidance notes given by ICC is making this point very clear now. Again, the connection between the various contracts, if you remember the initial picture which we discussed, the starting point is the contract of sale. And after that comes the contract of carriage, the contract of insurance, your arrangement for customs clearance, whether it is the export side, import side. So the connection between all these things also is now very clearly defined in the guidance notes which are given. A lot of explanatory notes has been added. Reordering has been done, especially in the D section, if you see, which is giving prominence to the delivery and risk on the cargo. Onboard notation on BL. This has been again a practical issue where the container is already loaded and the seller sometimes requests for an onboard BL, though onboard literally can be given only when the containers are physically on board the ship. However, for meeting the obligations with the buyer or a banking system which is there, especially under letter of credit transactions, the buyer may request for an onboard notation on the BL even before it is on board, which the carrier cannot give. So in many cases, they normally give a receipt for shipment bill of lading, which sometimes the banks don't accept. So again, the guidance note in Incoterms 2020 says that yes, carriers can give that with the provision that the understanding is that it is not really on board the ship, but it is typically a receipt for shipment, but for the sake of meeting the bank's expectations, if the vessel is already known and fixed, they can give an onboard notation in the BL. Another major change which is come in is that the seller is contracting for insurance in two terms, as we saw. One is in CIP, which is for all modes of transport, and CIF for marine or inland waterways. In the previous case, there was only a minimum cover, which was the obligation of the seller when they are contracting for the insurance, which is under the Institute Cargo Clauses C. Whereas now, they have made a variation that if it is CIP, the minimum obligation of the seller is to include Institute Cargo Clauses A, which always has got a higher coverage, because it is understood that wherever there is multimodal transport, the extent of risk which is there is going up. Whereas in CIF, the minimum obligation is institute cargo clauses C. But however, if the seller and buyer agrees in the sales contract that it has to be a higher coverage with cargo clauses C, it has to be explicitly mentioned in the contract. There are also cases where at either end, depending upon the type of term which is used, the other party may have their own transport which is arranged, right? For example, if the buyer is buying FCA from, say, China, and the Chinese supplier says that they have got their own transport which can deliver the cargo up to the port, it is a matter of negotiation between the two parties to agree on those in terms of a notional cost for that particular transportation. So this also now clearly the guidance is given that yes, they can do that, but again, ensure that these kind of variations are always mentioned. Obligations are clearly defined. So here is a summary of that. There are 10 sections of obligations which are clearly defined in the Incoterms books. So starting with general obligations, delivery, what's the responsibility of the seller, and what's the responsibility of buyer in terms of taking the delivery, where does the risk transfer, what are the things which comes under carriage, insurance which is tied again to transfer of risk, what kind of transport documents are required, export and import clearance, which is again a major responsibilities which is defined under Incoterms, what kind of packaging, checking and markings which needs to be there, what are the different allocation of costs, and the kind of notices which needs to be given to the other party. So as a recap, it has always to be borne in mind as to what constitutes delivery. It should not be confused with physical discharge of cargo. Delivery is the point which is defined under Incoterms, where the responsibility, especially the risk on the cargo, is transferring from the seller to the buyer. Ensure that you are using the correct version. It does not mean that you cannot continue to use 2010 version or even 2000 version. By all means, you do that, but ensure that if you are using a different term which is not there in the 2020 version, for example, I still see contracts where people use DDU, which is not there in 2020 version, not even in 2010 version. It is there in 2000 version. But if both the parties are comfortable with that term and they agree and they understand the responsibilities which are defined under DDU, please ensure that you are mentioning DDU as per Incoterms 2000. Otherwise, especially where there are terms, for example, CIP has got a different definition under 2010 version as compared to now in the 2020 version. So it is very important that you put the version number of the Incoterm also in the contract. There are obligations which are defined, so it is imperative that both the parties have to perform as per the obligations which are stated. It is not mandatory or compulsory to use Incoterms. You can have contracts without Incoterms, but the moment you incorporate that, it becomes legally enforceable as defined by the ICC. Once you say that it is as per Incoterms, you cannot have your own interpretation. Both the parties cannot have their own interpretation. We saw that in D terms, there are additional risks which the seller is taking with respect to quantity, quality, and delivery timing. So wherever the actual practice is different, the variations have to be agreed in the sales contract. There is freight and insurance which is paid under the C terms. If it is CIP or CIF, there is additional insurance cost also which the seller is bearing. And wherever you are using variation, Incoterms itself, there is a lot to be careful about. But the moment you are using a variation, it is very, very important that both the parties agree and then record it in the sales contract. So what is the recommended usage here? So just as a recap, so we have 7 terms here with for combinations. Starting from X works, there is loading of the cargo, which becomes FCA. The moment freight is also done by the seller, it becomes CPT. And when seller takes the responsibility to pay the cost of insurance, it becomes CIP. And the moment the seller says that they won't take control or risk up to the destination, it starts with delivered at place, DAP, where unloading is also included by the seller. It becomes delivered place unloaded. And if import cost and responsibility is also taken by the seller, it becomes delivered duty paid. Now there are 4 terms which comes for only marine or inland seaways. You start with free alongside ship, where the cargo is kept ready at a port, and the moment the seller takes the responsibility to load onto the ship, it becomes FOB, free on board. And if seller takes the responsibility to do the contract of carriage, it becomes CFR. And if insurance is also done by the seller, it becomes CIF. Coming back to where we started by discussing the various, the main contracts which are there. So the starting point is the contract of sale between the seller and the buyer. And based on that, there is a contract of carriage between the merchant and the carrier. Up to a certain point, there's a contract of carriage by the seller. Beyond that, there's a contract of carriage by the buyer. And because of the risk which is involved, there is a contract of insurance. Again, both the parties will need insurance based on where the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer. And then you have certain other not so very explicit written contracts, but in terms of the practice of the trade and the stipulations by the authorities, you have export clearances which are required and import clearances at the other place. So ultimately, what it is, the whole driving point is that there is movement of goods which are involved. There is physical movement of goods involved, because of which you have the aspects which comes in the contract of carriage and contract of insurance. And there is a lot of information which needs to move. So under the obligations, the 10 major obligation headings and Incoterms, we will find that even information is included, because without proper information, there is no point in just moving the goods. The goods can arrive in a mode of transport in a safe manner, but if the information is not available for clearing those goods, the goods are as good as being told that they are not delivered. And then of course you've got the aspects of movement of money. So these are the 3 aspects in any trade, which is the movement of the goods, the movement of information, and the movement of money. So you will find that the aspects of documentation or the way things needs to be done, everything is tied up along with the payment assurances or the modes of payment, which will be discussed in a separate session. Hope this session gave you a very good insight into Incoterms, the various Incoterms which are used, the way in which it has to be interpreted in a contract of sale, how to assess the right term to be used, or if you already have contracts in place, how to assess the gaps which are there potentially when it comes to dealing with the buyer or the seller, depending upon which particular role you are playing in that particular contract. We also dealt with the variations or the interfaces which are there with the contract of carriage, how inadvertently we sometimes use Incoterms in contracts of carriage, and when an issue happens, we are dealing with potential risk on the cargo, and sometimes even we don't get the insurance which we think existed. My name is Krishnan. I'm based in Dubai. You've got the contact details on this slide. Please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is called Logbook, for many more free videos which gives introduction to the various topics related to supply chain, logistics and shipping, and career related to this particular field. Feedback is welcome. You can use my email or connect with me over LinkedIn. Have a great day.